This is the largest online event that the Green Party has ever held, and we're going to go until around 8 to 8:15, depending on the stamina of our panelists, your moderator, and all of you. I really want to just go through a few housekeeping issues. So first of all, thank you to everyone who sent us questions in ahead of time. And we will be asking as many of those questions as we have time. I'm going to begin tonight by introducing each one of the three experts and advocates for basic income who have been so generous to share their time with us tonight. And so I'll introduce one, ask some questions and have a discussion, introduce the second, same, and then the third, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you that you've sent to us. And but before I do that, I actually want to just establish a little context for tonight's discussion. The Green Party for many years has been advocating a basic income, and it's unfortunate that it's taken this COVID-19 pandemic to really open up and almost have a nationwide experiment in a basic income. Though the CERB is not quite a basic income, it certainly has become very close to one. And even in countries like the United States, you have President Trump sending checks to people. You have Spain talking about not only having a basic income during this crisis, but post-pandemic. And so I think it's a really appropriate time to have this conversation. I think one of the things that this crisis has shown us is just the many cracks that exist in our social safety nets, and that far too many Canadians and Ontarians have fallen through those cracks. And government hasn't always been there pre-pandemic to fill those gaps or during the crisis, which is one of the reasons you've seen the CRB, I think, change and go through so many iterations, even just in the very short time it's been here. Ontario had a pilot project that was brought in by the previous government, and one of our panelists was a participant in that pilot project, and unfortunately it was canceled prior to completion. But there's been some interesting findings that have come out of that, the pilot project in Ontario, that's confirmed many of the positive findings that existed in a previous pilot that was done in Manitoba in Canada, and that's been done by other pilot projects around the world. And I don't want to get too much into that, but just to say that when researchers at McMaster University studied what was the aborted Ontario pilot for a basic income, they declared that it was nothing short of a success. And so I think now is the perfect time to talk about what a basic income means for us now and in the present crisis, and what it can mean for us moving forward as we look for ways to address poverty and create a floor that nobody can go below. And all the basic income is just direct cash payments to people that's available to everyone to ensure that there's an economic floor that nobody falls below. And many people have argued that it can be the most efficient and effective way of addressing poverty. And it's one of the reasons you've seen people on the left and the right and in the middle of the political spectrum all express support for a basic income. So I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion. And I want to begin by introducing Josephine Grey, who will be our first panelist in conversation with me. I've known Josephine for many years. We first met way back in the 1990s, working on a number of projects around local currencies and environmental issues. Josephine's a human rights advocate and a community organizer who founded Low Income Families Together, which is a resource center for low-income families in Toronto. She was also the lead author for Ontario's report to the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and has been a proponent of a basic income guarantee to address poverty, inequality, and food insecurity. So Josephine, thanks for joining us and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. It's a real honor to have you here. And I'm just going to begin by asking you, if you could just talk a bit about how does your work on human rights and food security relate to a basic income guarantee?
Well, I've been an organizer and a low-income single parent for over 30 years, and I was very attracted to it since I first read about it in the 80s. And I realized that, people as diverse as Martin Luther King and Milton Friedman had brought it up as a way to address issues. Early on, it seemed like a way better way to help single mothers like myself. And as I gained experience and understanding of economic conditions for other people, I began to realize how important basic income could be for communities and society in general. As an organizer, I've experienced a lot of changes over 3 decades. After the deep cuts to social programs and the end of social program standards in 1995, the end of CAP, which came with NAFTA, and the rise of corporate rule, changes in community and for families were drastic and profound. At the time, LIFT was working on community economic development. But after 95, low-income people simply could not engage anymore. Conditions worsened, more and more became homeless, mothers were losing their children because they were too poor to feed and house them. And then the notion of a basic income seemed almost impossible, even while the need for it was obvious. It became really hard to organize with anybody. There was too much fear, chaos, chronic insecurity, people moving, going to shelters, losing their phone numbers, couldn't afford to get on the bus. And poor diets come with poor incomes, and engaging people in organizing for food security was as hard as any other issue, but even more painful because, most mothers know their families need better food, but they can't afford it. So few problems are more agonizing than being unable to properly nourish our children. So it became obvious every month that if we had something that would uphold basic human rights, like a basic income, affordable housing, and the latter, based on my experience, nothing short of an adequate basic income would fix these issues and begin to bring us out of the horrible mess that Tories made. In the last decade or so, we were starting to, rise out of some of the worst parts of this mess. But now we're in a state of free fall.
Right. It's interesting that you say that it's interesting you point out that Martin Luther King and Milton Friedman, two people you would completely see on the opposite ends of the political spectrum. And it's interesting because even Richard Nixon at one point, for all of his flaws, had talked about a basic income as well. And so I'm just thinking in the current political moment, I know that you've talked about this and others have talked about the importance of a guaranteed income in the context of a Green New Deal and the climate crisis. And how do you see how those go hand in hand?
Well, I think not only would people in poverty have more dignity and security, we'd all be able to enabled to make healthier choices as parents, consumers, workers. We'd be able to choose different forms of livelihood. People who are working in destructive things that are destructive to the environment would be able to step back, take time, pick another profession, etc. Everything's become so precarious. Insecure employment has been increasing by about 3% a year since the 80s, and cost of living has skyrocketed while the values of income have fallen. So, we really need something to stabilize us. We can't transform and make a transition when everybody's so chronically insecure and unstable. I was working alongside civil servants and lawyers on social assistance and fair tax policies in the 90s. I also noticed that many higher income earners suffer from a poverty of time, which also harms personal and family health. Think of nurses and doctors right now, for example. I saw studies in Europe lamenting the high rates of burnout in professional occupations. What we have to realize is that freedom of choice of our time is absolutely key to our quality of life and whether or not we're able to experience human rights, whether we have low or high incomes. Because human rights are based on self-determination, freedom of choice, being able to leave bad working conditions, being able to enter education, all of those things which almost no one has anymore. So if we're going to be able to make a transition to society and work together and innovate and try new things, we have to have some basic security, and we have to be able to plan our time, plan in our communities, plan for our families. And we also have to be able to engage effectively in democracy, which is much more than putting a ballot in a box, especially at a time like now, as we come out of the pandemic. How do we create, a just and sustainable post-pandemic economy, a post-pandemic world that is actually livable? It's going to take a lot of people working together, the civil society with civil service. And for the civil service, I watch them scrambling to figure out how to cover everybody with the emergency benefit and adding on people as they go along. Meanwhile, all these problems have happened for so many people. And if they had just put a basic income in place in the first place, or if we'd already had one, we wouldn't have all this chaos, and it'll be much, much easier on the civil service as well. So I think there's so many pros and advantages to a basic income, especially at a time when we drastically need to be able to change. You know, I can't imagine really any arguments against it anymore.
Well, I'm going to just ask you one more quick question before I go to Jessie. I really like the way you talked about how a basic income can benefit everyone, and because sometimes it isn't always seen that way. And so I think that may be an important part of how do we make a basic income a part of a post-pandemic recovery?
Well, I think one of the things that's really interesting is that, you know, we've been doing a lot of work on policy options and how to afford it and the like. And what we find is that, you know, as long as we fold up the programs that were only for income support and fix the tax system in a way that's better for everybody and more fair for everybody across the board, we are in a much more stable position, and we can actually afford a basic income without increasing government investment, without increasing government spending. But also we see already from pilots and here, there, and everywhere that more people will go to better jobs, will get better education, their health outcomes will improve a lot. So we'll be saving in terms of health costs, we'll be saving in terms of helping people recover their health, recover their families, recover their businesses. Everybody's going to need time to be able to do that, both, you know, on their own and together. So if we're going to like, you know, get our small businesses back on their feet and be able to, you know, fix kids' education and all of that stuff, we're going to have control and a control of our time and be able to rely on a basic floor of income. And there's no question that we can afford it.
Great, thank you, Josephine. I really appreciate that. So we're going to move to Jessie Golem, and I see that the chat box is very active. So I love to see the engagement. And I just want to quickly, before I introduce our next guest, just say a big thanks to my staff who are working very hard on all the tech to make sure this goes smoothly. So a big cheer for them. And I now want to welcome Jessie Golem, who's a writer, researcher, artist, and photographer, who is one of the 4,000 participants selected for Ontario's Basic Income Pilot in 2017. When the pilot was canceled, she became one of the lead advocates to try and save it and started the project Humans for Basic Income. And I think, and Jessie, you can confirm this for me, I think I was one of the very first politicians when we met at Queen's Park who was part of your amazing series of photographs of supporters of a basic income.
That's correct. That's correct, Mike. You were one of the first politicians, and I've always found support and love with the Green Party. So thank you.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thanks for joining us.
Of
and I'm
course.
If you could open, I mean, you've had the lived experience of being a part of the Ontario pilot, and can you share what that experience was like for you?
Certainly. So like life before basic income, I had 4 jobs. I've never been able to own a house. All my jobs were minimum wage, gig economy jobs, very much all contract work, no benefits, no protection, retirement savings. What is that? You know, like, so it was always very, very difficult. And all those jobs, I was just trying to start my own business and I wanted to be a photographer. So when I signed up for the Basic Income Pilot and I was able to get that money, I was like, oh my gosh, I can actually do this. I can pursue what I've been trying to pursue, work towards pursuing for this long. But like, it's very, very hard to start a business. No matter what kind of business you're starting, you need capital investment. And then in my situation, I also needed to have that floor of my, like Josephine was talking about, so I can make sure I can pay my rent every month, or I can have food on the table every month and cover all my bills from the cost of living. And I'd never been able to do that. So I was always going like, you know, from one job to the next job to the next job, working 60 to 80 hour weeks, just exhausted, but still like going into the red every single month, is still very much struggling financially and struggling to survive. So then when I got basic income, I was able to quit those jobs, but then I wasn't losing any money because then I had that free time to pursue my photography business. So I was actually finding I was making more money as a photographer, and my business was growing because I had that time to invest in it. I wasn't locked into these minimum wage gig jobs. I was able to determine my own prices for myself. I was able to build my business and see it grow and have that time to invest in it, which turned into a better economic investment both in my life, and then I was able to buy more things and improve my life. So it was really, really good that way. Obviously, the pilot got canceled, and that really, for myself, changed everything, and for a lot of people that were on the pilot. So I've been able to hear all of these stories and talk to these people and know all these stories and kind of witness firsthand how devastating the cancellation of that basic income pilot was.
So Jessie, you've been a critic of the Ford government canceling the pilot, but a very vocal and I think creative advocate for a basic income based on your own experience. And thank you for sharing your story. I'm curious, some of the people that who were also a part of the program and you've photographed, can you maybe just share a bit of some ways in which the program helped them and made their lives better?
Yeah, I saw a lot of stories. It was interesting because before any of this happened, I'd never been an advocate for most things. I've always participated in government. I've voted every single time. I've been aware of what's going on, but never as an issue so strongly and directly affected me. It was a bit of a humbling experience for me to realize that most people, people who do advocate, they do because there are issues that affect them and affect their livelihood and their lives. And so for me to be thrown myself into this world really changed that and opened my eyes to that world, and just to see the response of politicians. Some politicians were more responsive and some were less. On the pilot, it was interesting, the stories I heard were that people were like myself using basic income to build businesses. A lot of people were going back to school. A lot of people were investing in their children. So a lot of people were like, I don't need to go to a food bank anymore. I can buy fresh food for my children, or I can put my child into a sports class or music or an extracurricular that can be very beneficial. And I took piano lessons my entire life, and now I'm a professional piano teacher. These things are super important to the enrichment and development of young people. So a lot of that, and a lot of just seeing people actually physically get out of poverty. So there were some people that were ODSP recipients, Ontario Disability Support, if you aren't in Ontario, who are just scraping by and living in what is a bit of a welfare trap, because as soon as you make any money, then the government claws back that funding that you get. So it sort of creates this disincentive, except you're still scraping by with barely enough to live off of. So you're trapped. And so I saw a lot of those stories, and people trying and actually physically getting themselves out of it. One of my very, very good friends who was on the pilot, she's an osteopathic practitioner. So she used basic income to pay for her schooling, because she would work as a bartender. So she would be working all night up until 3 a.m, working at her bar, then up early the next morning and studying and working and trying to get clients and trying to do everything. So it was incredibly hard. Another family that are also good friends of mine, they found out they were pregnant while on the basic income pilot. So their decision to have their child and raise their child and choose a safer house for their newborn, and they also have an 8-year-old, was hugely impacted by the basic income pilot and trying to give them more healthier outcomes. I can go on.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing. And one of the things you mentioned is you've described yourself as a gig economy worker. And It was interesting because when the pandemic started, the federal government announced an expanded EI, and there were all kinds of people who fell through the cracks, particularly gig economy workers. So then they came in to their credit with the CERB, but then we found out there was a whole bunch of people who fell through those cracks. So then they expanded and shifted that, and there were still people falling through the cracks. And by the way, people on ODSP and Ontario Works in Ontario are still falling through the cracks, because if they do qualify for the CERB, the provincial government's clawing back those benefits like they do work when you work. So that's still a big issue of an important segment of our population still falling through the cracks. And as Josephine said, it would have been so much easier if we just had the program in place. And so I'm just wondering, as we think about recovering from the pandemic, what a permanent basic income would do for gig workers and people who work in the gig economy.
Right? Like it's crazy. I've thought about the same thing too. Like seeing the CERB roll out and also sort of seeing like when it first rolled out, about 800,000 people were falling through the cracks. And there were stories that I was getting because I actually started a new campaign. It's just called like CERB won't help me. And it's a hashtag, and people have been sending me photos and they're holding signs saying how they're falling through the cracks. So like there's some people who've emailed me, and there's social workers who have like lost the majority of their clientele, but ethically cannot feel like they can stop working, but now they're not making $5,000 and they're not meeting the eligibility requirements. I also, somebody contacted me who's an immigrant, a newcomer to Canada, who spent her first year here learning English, and then she got a job, but again, like then 2 weeks later got laid off due to the pandemic, so isn't eligible for anything. And this is a newcomer. Like this is somebody we should welcome here and bring into our country and help them succeed as much as we can. So there was a lot of that. Students. So like it's been really awful to hear about this and see those things and think like we're in the middle of like a global emergency. Like nothing like this has happened before. The last time we had a pandemic was 100 years ago in a much less globalized society than we are living in now. So why wouldn't we bring this in? And why can't we not take this as a very, very hard lesson that, you know, we're not so immune to these natural disasters. Like it only took like a couple of weeks for this pandemic to take place and throw everybody off. So how easily the world can be dismantled. Why would we not have a measure like a basic income in place?
Great. Thanks for sharing that, Jessie. And I think we're going to go to Floyd now, and then we'll move on to questions that we've received from the participants. So I'd like to now introduce Floyd Marinescu, who is a CEO, investor, and creator of C4 Media. And he's been one of the biggest champions for basic income, who is a part of the business community. And when the basic income pilot was canceled in Ontario, he brought together 100 CEOs for basic income, which I know that number is now far exceeded 100 CEOs. And I had the real privilege of hosting a news conference at Queen's Park, opposing the Ford government canceling the basic income pilot. And Floyd and Jessie both were there. And so it was the first opportunity we had to meet. And as somebody who's started some businesses myself, I appreciated Floyd's perspective on just what a difference a basic income would make for entrepreneurs. And in particular, in Floyd's case, he's more recently brought together a number of basic income supporters under a project called UBI Works. So Floyd, I want to say welcome. Thanks for joining us. And I just want to, first of all, ask, most people don't think of a CEO as being an activist for basic income. So tell us how you became a CEO activist for a basic income.
Well, I think I first heard about basic income when I heard Elon Musk talking about it. And I was just immediately kind of blown away by the concept. Like we can have a market-oriented system. We can have the economic system that leaves no one behind, where everyone can be okay, where everyone can meet their potential in life and not fall into poverty traps. And I just couldn't stop thinking about it. I just, especially his reasons for it, given automation, since my background is in software development, and I run large conferences for thousands of software engineers to come and learn, and I can see what's going on with the trends in tech. And on a personal note, I grew up in a house with domestic violence, and if my mother had money, she could have left. And it would have been a whole different future for me, for her, and it would have changed the power dynamics, which is why the whole aspect of freedom and of empowerment is kind of missing in the conversation. That basic income is ultimately about individual freedoms, and that's a very important message that is not out there enough.
You know, it's interesting. A number of tech entrepreneurs and Andrew Yang, the most prominent after his run for the presidency, have talked about the connection between automation and the need for a basic income. And you alluded to that in your first answer. Could you just expand on that a little bit? Why you think automation, what is the connection between automation and the need for a basic income?
Yeah, so what we've seen is 40 years of automation, both since the rise of mainframe computers to personal computing to robotics to the internet facing now, artificial intelligence. All technology has been the underlying trend behind all the other trends people tend to point to when they talk about inequality, when they talk about what's happening with unions losing leverage and all the things that people point to as to why we have problems in our economic system. So it's my view, and it's the position taken by UBI Works, that it's our failure to recognize that technology is our shared inheritance. It's the contributions of inventors from the past. Every entrepreneur builds on ideas from companies that had products from before them, and on science, on things that were contributed by academia. We should share in the gains of technology. And the fact that we haven't is why we have a lot of the working poverty today, why we have people having to work harder and longer than their parents. Millennials these days are going to make an order of magnitude less potential to earn wealth and to make a living wage than their parents and grandparents. So this is all happening amidst some of the greatest technological improvements imaginable. So how is it that the world is getting more sophisticated, more technology, more features, all these things happening, but yet people are working harder and longer and are worse off than generations before? So we're actually for a universal basic income and is in a flat amount for everyone, because we see that as fixing capitalism versus the basic income guarantee fixes poverty. They're both very important. If the flat dividend can be as high or even higher than a basic income guarantee, it solves both poverty and it fixes capitalism, because people who are making $40,000 a year or $50,000 a year or $60,000 a year, they could still use an extra $1,000 a month or $1,500 a month or whatever we can do. So we want to find a way that actually shares in the gains from technology, from globalization, from these trends that have eroded the capacity for a market system to actually better its people and fix the root cause. The root cause of poverty is not people's failure in character. The root cause of poverty is an economic system where you actually can't get enough from work. Working poverty is a market failure, and a UBI would solve that. Now, obviously, it's going to be very expensive if you're going to do a full-on UBI, and we're working on costing plans for that. In the meantime, I think a basic guarantee would be a compassionate and a very practical first step. But we don't want to stop there. We want to go beyond that and also advocate for a full dividend to all Canadians as a way to make our economic system work for everyone. Because frankly, we all deserve it. You know, we're all shareholders in our economy. We can all have a piece of the growth and not have it only go to the top. Have it engage everyone. It'll grow the middle class. It'll create a middle class lifestyle and opportunity for everyone. And it prevents what I think is the true problem with technology. The real issue with technology is not some future with no jobs. There'll always be more jobs. The real issue of technology is wage and labor polarization. What we see is that what used to be in the economy of our parents and grandparents had a huge middle class, but we're seeing the middle class shrinking, and most of the new jobs being created are low-income jobs. So fundamentally, looking into the future, I don't think the old styles of taxing and the old systems are going to work, because when we have huge polarization of earnings, a universal system can last longer. If it's not universal, if it's seen as a social program, how long will it be until people in the top 30% don't want to have a much bigger tax burden than others? So therefore, if we all get it, it's more defendable. It's a public utility, like roads, like airports, like electricity, electrifying the economy that no one can be unhappy with because everyone's getting it. So, you know, I'm really concerned about a 21st century economy that shares in the gains so we can all prosper and we can frankly realize the promise of technology, which is to create prosperity for everyone. And that's how I see UBI. A proper UBI will also end poverty, but also fixes capitalism.
And I just want to ask one more question, because one of the things I've noticed with the pandemic is there are people talking about a basic income that I never thought I would ever see talking about it. And some of those folks are only saying it as an emergency situation, not as a permanent situation. But others have come out and said, you know, this is maybe something we should be looking at doing permanently. And so I'm wondering how you think the current pandemic has changed the conversation around a basic income in the business community?
Well, in the business community, first of all, everyone's scared. I mean, a lot of people that I know have had to do great layoffs. I've had to do layoffs in my business, first time ever. It was really sad. And we want to know that we can all build up this new economy together. You know, we want to grow together. Business owners don't like the fact that there's poverty and there's massive inequality. They don't, and they also don't see themselves as responsible for it either. We want to be part of a system that uplifts everyone. We want to be players in a system where everyone wins. No, nobody goes there and says, I'm going to start a business and get rich while other people are poor. That's not how entrepreneurs think. So what we're seeing now is business entrepreneurs, CEOs who are following, who understand what's going on with technology, know that this next recovery is going to be a lot worse than all the previous ones. Every recovery in the last 40 years, even after 10, 15 years of gains, has left most people worse off in terms of their income gaining potential, their wealth accumulation potential, and technology is one of the main reasons. So the technology that exists today is way in a whole different universe, better and more sophisticated than one existed in 2008. What happened after 2008? We had almost 15 years of growth that still created working poverty, that still created massive inequality, that still had almost stagnant income gains. I'm not looking forward to that kind of recovery. We need a UBI now so that the recovery will be more inclusive, so that everyone can have a chance to build themselves up and retrain themselves, frankly, because look at how much technology has changed. I mean, even Facebook was just starting in 2008. Airbnb didn't exist. Uber didn't exist. The gig economy barely existed then. How much worse is it going to be 10 years from now as we're slicing and dicing the traditional job into all kinds of small gig jobs that are paying, that is effectively a race to the bottom in a pure market system. So we need a UBI so that everyone has a chance to build on top of their income. We can end working poverty and give everyone a chance to enter the middle class. And frankly, we can stimulate the economy, because businesses would rather have predictable revenues than low taxes. You need predictability to grow an economy. Predictability is not only the privilege of businesses. People need to predict what their future will look like too, and they can make long-term decisions based on that.
Yeah, I appreciate your comments here. I think one of the things that's distressed me about previous recessions, which obviously in the last, let's say, 40 years haven't been as bad as what we're going through right now, but it seems like the bailout package is always top down. And we hope that there'll be trickle down economics. We can bail out the banks and bail out big businesses and hope it trickles down to everyone else. And one thing I like about a basic income is I call it trickle up or trickle out economics, is that that will actually create more liquidity or cash flow in our economy, which will ultimately benefit businesses if everyone has an adequate income to meet their basic needs. So I appreciate your perspective on that. So I want to bring Jessie and Josephine back into the conversation. And I have some questions here. I wrote some down that people emailed in prior to tonight, which I'll start with. And then I've noticed, Jessie, you in particular, and Josephine too, you both have been replying to people in the chat box. So I'm trying not to be distracted by that, but there's a great conversation happening there. So thank you for that. So I think what I'll do in the interest of time, so we have a little over about a half an hour or so. I think I may direct the questions to one of you and then direct another question to another one. But if you feel like you really want to make a point, don't hesitate to jump in, okay? And so, Josephine, I think I'll start with you. And so this is the longest question that came in text-wise. But somebody asked, how would a basic income replace or streamline existing programs like old age security, Canada Child Benefit, social assistance, employment insurance? Would these be replaced, or how would eligibility be determined? I think questions really around, like, how do you make sure it's equitable as you move forward?
Indeed. I mean, I think for sure we'd want to replace social assistance. It's a dreadful program. Just consider right this moment, while people are getting $2,000 a month, people on welfare are still getting $700. It's really awful. So we would roll up things like welfare and various little income programs, worker tax benefits, stuff like that, that are complicated and hard to administer, et cetera. We would roll those into the basic income. The Basic Income Canada Network has 3 policy options that they propose. And the first 2 would keep and preserve the Canada Child Benefit, and the first policy option would keep and preserve the old age pension. And I think this is something that could be done also gradually. We could start with, one group in society maintaining the, basic income like benefits we already have, like the child benefit and old age, and then we could expand those. So we would save a lot of money by rolling those income programs together, both at the federal, provincial level, and combining them. And what we would do is make sure that the amount of money being received every month was much closer to the low income measure, like what it actually costs to live in any given area. That would have to be really carefully looked at. It costs an awful lot more to live in the north in the winter, for example, or to live in the city of Toronto than almost anywhere else. We'd also have to look at making sure that we had things like affordable housing, affordable childcare, pharmacare, dental care, things like that would be untouched. But these things would also become more affordable once people had better incomes and we were able to make better health choices. So it's really a matter of balancing what we have with what doesn't work, folding things that don't work into funding what the basic income requires, and also looking at a variety of ways to make our tax system much more fair and more like it used to be in the past, where there is a greater share coming from the corporate sector and from higher incomes. And there's a more rational tax system that isn't nearly as complex and doesn't try to do all these little things, because I really feel for civil servants trying to manage all this mess. So I think there's a lot of really clear, rational ways and proposals that are being put forward. And yeah, ultimately having a UBI, as Floyd proposes, is I think a great end game. We have to get there step by step. And then we have laid out a lot of cost benefit analysis and a lot of calculations to show how it can actually be achieved.
Great, thanks. So Floyd, I'm going to put you on the spot with this next question. And I apologize. I know you said your group is looking at costing. So I know you haven't done it yet, but the question is, how can the government afford this, especially in the current economic downturn and with deficit spending? How do you avoid breaking the bank and still delivering a basic income?
Well, I'm sure many in this call may know, but the PBO estimated net cost of a basic income would be about $43 billion. And then if you combine a lot of the federal and provincial programs that are similar, you could bring it down to a cost of around $24 billion, which would be just a 3% GST increase. Now, that would not be a dividend for all. That would be an income guarantee that would end poverty. I think 3% GST increase end poverty, we should have done it yesterday. What are we waiting for? I mean, imagine all the hardship that would be avoided. Imagine how much efficiency there'd be in government. And it's really upsetting that they're not doing that. And why aren't they doing that? Because a lot of these established powers aren't comfortable with all the job losses in government that will happen. That's frankly a shame. A lot of people are suffering now. Millions of people are out of work. I think we can make sacrifices and end poverty right now and do it quickly. And now for an actual dividend, you got to look at more creative ways of investing in that. And I think we should be looking at wider problems in our society that can be solved with the right taxation systems that would go back to fund a dividend for all. And frankly, I think the Green Party has the best platform for that, because I don't think this is a situation where you can tax the wealthy to pay the poor, like a wealth tax and stuff like that, because at the end of the day, like, no one thinks they're responsible for the problems in our system. I think we should have taxes that disproportionately affect the wealthy, but are consistent and fair and affect everyone. But because the dividend going to everyone is high enough to end poverty, everyone's still better off. So, for example, the Green Party, I believe, believes in economic rents, land value taxes, things like that are consistent and uniform and won't be considered as somehow chasing the wealthy and having them leave the country, like happens in other parts of Europe. Now, I'm personally not overly opposed to more left-leaning tax systems on a personal level. I'm just trying to think about what will last long-term in terms of societal stability. So we should get there. I mean, Guy Standing is one of the most foremost experts on the basic income movement for over 40 years. He says, well, why don't we just start small? Why don't we just start with $500 to everyone? And that can be on top of your social assistance. So you don't lose your social assistance if you get it. And maybe the incremental tax increase to do that will be small. But then as a society, we would have the solidarity to continue finding ways to share in the gains by looking at the concept of economic rents, which is taxing the use and abuse of nature, taxing things that affect our common property, like the air, like carbon taxes, like the land, like mineral resource extraction, things like that are effectively taking from things we commonly own, and let's share in those gains because those things belong to us in the first place.
Guy Standing wrote a book about that. It's called The
Yeah.
Power of the Commons. And
Yeah.
anybody who's listening, I highly recommend it. It's a really great work. And he spoke about this topic at the Basic Income Earth Conference in India last August. And it's the idea of like, you know, we don't pay for the air that we breathe, and we shouldn't have to pay for the water we drink. The land that we all live on, it's the commons. And so the idea of us having a basic income as part of the commons, as our entitled right as humans to live on this planet.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in Norway, the consumption taxes are 25%. Here, it's like what, 10 to 15, depending on your province.
Yes.
That could
I'll
go
write out the name
for
of the
everyone,
book in the
maybe.
chat.
If I could just interject real quick, in the last election, we put forward a platform that showed how we did a bit of combination of what all of you have said. So we looked at slight increases in corporate taxes on large corporations, a more progressive tax system, but also increasing taxes on resources to show how we could roll out and pay for a basic income in Ontario. And we were worried that our amounts were incorrect. And then when Lisa McLeod got up and canceled the basic income pilot, the number she used was the exact number we had estimated. So we actually showed how you could do it. So Jessie, I just want to ask, based on your experience, this next question I think would be good direct to you, is based on your experience in meeting people through Humans for Basic Income, do you think there should be a different amount for a basic income based on where you live? And Josephine kind of hinted at this earlier, that you know, it's the cost of living in Toronto versus Guelph, you know, where my riding is, or versus the North is very different. And so have you had thoughts on that in your interactions with people around the province?
I have, because like I grew up actually in a very, very small town called Hanover, Ontario, and where I grew up, there is no public transit, so you have to have a car. Employment is it's either based on agriculture or industry. There's a nuclear power plant that actually my dad works at, but like I left the area because I couldn't get a job there. If I were to stay in Hanover, my choices of jobs were McDonald's or Tim Hortons. So that's why I ended up moving to the city, moving to Hamilton, sorry. And so it's interesting because, yeah, like the cost of living is different. How that cost gets distributed is different. Like if I live in the city, I might not necessarily need to have a car. Whereas when I lived up in my hometown, I definitely needed to have a car. So like, it's just different. And we think about like far northern communities where the cost for groceries alone is just frightening. It's how it's distributed. I'm not an economics expert besides on this issue, so I don't know how it should be distributed, but I do think that needs to be taken into consideration, that the lifestyles of people in different parts of Canada, for instance, or Ontario, for instance, we're just such a big country and such a vast country with people living in so many different places that where the expenses and distribution of costs is just different. Yeah. Somebody just messaged in the chat, if I was receiving a UBI, would I have left Hanover? I don't know. My family would certainly love me to stay up in Hanover and be up with them. I've been in the city for long enough that I was able to pursue my career in the city. But honestly, like if the opportunity had been presented to me a decade ago when I decided to leave my hometown and move to the city, I probably would have stayed in my hometown if I had a basic income and I was able to. Yeah.
Josephine, I'm going to go to you for this next question because you hinted at this in an earlier answer. So somebody's asking, how much money would it save if we brought in a basic income? And so I think what they're referring to is probably healthcare and other things. So would you like to comment on that? Oh, we may be having an audio issue.
There we go.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah, there's been a lot of projections around that, and you can look and see more detailed analysis at Basic Income Canada. But, you know, for instance, there have been calculations that we would save about 80 billion in health costs, that, you know, saving on the administration of policing the poor is a huge cost saving. that we would likely see a drop in crime and people having to be held and fed in jails. There's like a lot of different kinds of cost saving we could anticipate. I personally would like to point out too that, you know, I see people saying, well, if you want to live in the city, you should be ready to pay a lot more money. Well, a lot of poor people live in the city and we have no means to move out of the city. Yet there are many poor people who would also like to be able to live in the country, who would like to be involved in sustainable farming. And wouldn't it be nice if both the farmers and the farm workers could afford to come together and do more sustainable agriculture so we could affect climate change and make a healthier food system? But we can't do that locked in the current economic system. So the costs then, you know, you can't even begin to calculate all the cost savings that result from having a more resilient, more just, more humane system that, you know, both saves money and also generates money. Because when we have people with more money to spend and they're making healthier choices and they're, you know, propping up their local economy, we are increasing and encouraging our economy to grow in healthy ways rather than in destructive ways. So, you know, whether it's savings or adding economic value, you know, there's a lot to be said from a basic income point of view.
Yeah, so one of the criticisms of a basic income is that if you give people money, they won't have the motivation to work. So Floyd, I thought I would send this one your direction. As a business owner, do you think giving people a basic income will make them not want to go to work anymore?
No, because you keep the money when you go back to work. Imagine people on the CERB could keep the money when they go back to work. Why wouldn't you want to go back to work? You make more money. Who doesn't want more money? As simple as
Jessie,
that.
I'm wondering if you want to follow up, just because you interacted with a ton of people who were part of the basic income pilot. Did it affect people's motivations to work?
No, it did not. In fact, people were more motivated to work. People kind of saw it as an opportunity. And I've been I get a lot of that rhetoric of people being like, oh, if you get free money from the government, you're just going to be lazy and sit around playing video games all day and everything. That is not what I saw at all. And in fact, a lot of people were like, I have this opportunity. I can go back to school. I can start this business. I can do this thing that I was dreaming of. So I think we need to change that mindset. The idea of like the bootstraps, pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality is so outdated and frankly, scientifically and psychologically inaccurate. There have been studies conducted on basic income pilots all over the world. I worked with Floyd breaking down some of these studies, and in all those pilots, the answers were pretty similar across the board in that people were motivated to work and people still worked or worked more when having a basic income, because they had an opportunity for them to be able to decide that what work they wanted to do and how they want to give back. I think humans want to give back. Nobody wants to sit around doing nothing all day, which is why a pandemic is so difficult on us as a society.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
Over 105,000 people have been in
Yes.
over 16 pilots around the world in the last 50 years, and there was no decrease in labor participation.
Yeah, I think the evidence is pretty clear. So Josephine, just given your human rights background, somebody asked, should a basic income be considered a human right?
Well, absolutely. If you actually look at the human rights treaties that this country has signed, particularly in the rights of the child, one can't really imagine how one could actually uphold, respect, and defend our full human rights without a basic income. I mean, in fact, the current system we have undermines our human rights in so many ways. So it should not only be a human right, it is the foundation, I believe, of all the other human rights, as long as we have an economy based on money. And you know, if we want any kind of equality of outcomes, if we want to treat people with dignity, if we want people to have freedom from fear and want, which is the heart of human rights, we want people to have self-determination and choice. You know, none of that is possible when everybody's being shunted into these narrow, restrictive, highly policed little income programs every time they can't find a decent, sustaining job. And who can have that in this day and age? So yeah, I think it's an absolute necessity, not only as a human right in and of itself, but in order for us to have human rights at all.
Yeah, so I'm looking at some of the questions, comments in the chat box, and I'm actually thinking some of them relate to the next question I want to ask. And I want to ask all three of you. So maybe I'll maybe start with you, Floyd, and go to Jessie and then Josephine. all of you have been a part of advocating for a basic income. And so how do you think we can convince the public and the government that a basic income is a good idea? So do you want to start, Floyd?
I'm kind of new to politics, to be honest, and UBI is what brought me here. And at the end of the day, people want to be reelected. So I think if we start organizing locally and make a big show in our local ridings, people are going to be afraid. They're going to want to get reelected. It's kind of as simple as that. The Trudeau government has shown quite strongly that they're not interested in the basic income. They want to do increase the patchwork of means-tested systems. And unfortunately, I think the truth is that the economic crisis is going to be bigger than the COVID crisis. And what's going to happen after 4 months when I think 8 million people now in the CERB will no longer qualify? Like, is the government going to sit back and let all those people then apply for EI, where 4 out of 5 will be worse off, or onto social assistance, which has its work disincentives and those kinds of problems? So I think we need to make the case that we need a recovery UBI framed as a means of economic recovery, as that appeals to everyone, and we solve poverty at the same time. And that's what we'll be working towards at UBI Works.
Great. Jessie, what are your thoughts? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I have several thoughts. Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, so how do we convince the government and the public that a basic income is a good idea?
Yeah, like I have several thoughts on that. And I think one of the biggest things that I've seen just in my own work is that stories are effective. So like when the pilot in Ontario got canceled and I started asking for people to tell me their stories, it was both helpful for those people because they didn't feel like they had a place where they could speak, and then all of a sudden they had a platform that they could speak on, and that platform was just me and a camera, but it seemed to be enough. And but then people felt really impacted by those stories. They're like, I can relate to this person who received basic income and went back to school. I can relate to these people who, are starting a family, or this person is helping their children, or going back to work or starting businesses. So like stories, I think, are really, really powerful. And we now have stories of people around the world who are receiving basic incomes, are receiving investments that they're putting into their own lives and bettering their own lives for that. And I think people can get behind that. I think that's something that can inspire people and get behind that. Like certainly the studies that have been conducted and statistics and everything have that power and have that political power. But I do think that's also that human element that gets people to engage in governments and gets people to understand why we care about this. I mean, the only thing that I'm really qualified to do is take pictures and teach piano. Yet here I am talking about basic income as an economic issue, and it's because I got engaged with the government and I got engaged with this issue and put myself into it. So I feel like if I can do this, anybody can, and that these ideas can be accessible. And I think the big thing that helps it to be accessible is to give something that we can relate to, which is stories. That's fundamental to who we are as humans. We've always, since the dawn of time, shared stories.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about stories. Sometimes those of us in politics, or Greens in particular, we like to give everyone the facts, and sometimes the stories are more valuable. So what do you think, Josephine? What would be your recommendations on how we can convince government and the public to support a basic income?
Well, frankly, I've never seen so much potential for so many possibilities in my lifetime when it comes to addressing issues in society. We are coming out of a crazy chaotic, we're not even coming out yet. We are in a crazily chaotic situation. I think the government and civil service is as much needing and seeking answers as we are. And the more we come together to discuss these things, I've been involved in policy development with people in government. They are people too. They live here too. I think we can have these conversations. And what I love about the basic income is that it goes across political lines. It crosses many different kinds of ideologies. It speaks to everyone, just like human rights, therefore everyone. We're not trying to advantage one group over another. And if they want a way in which to ensure that this country can get back on its feet and move forward in a way that ensures that our children have a future, they're going to have to put a basic income into place in order to make that possible. Otherwise, they're going to spend years and years fiddling and fiddling and fiddling while the ship is sinking. So I think now is the best time ever to really, really push for this and to insist on it and to demand it and to remember, first and foremost, that the government is our government. We elect them, we pay them, they're working for us. And we've forgotten that. We've been trained to think that the government is the enemy, like it's some kind of weird hive mind of aliens. Let's drop that whole attitude and like be humans and talk to each other and make these changes and show them the advantages for everybody, them included, for everyone, like Floyd points out, even for, the 1%. Let's show them how this is an answer that allows them to do their job as a government and feel good about it.
Yeah, so I'm going to just do a follow-up question that's related to this, and it's also, I see it in the chat box as well, is when we talk about what an economic recovery will look like coming out of the current crisis, how would a basic income, what role would a basic income play in helping facilitate that recovery? I don't know. Floyd, do you want to start again?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, again, what people need is security. Both people and businesses, everyone needs to make long-term plans. So we already have a problem where after every economic recovery, every single recession has actually left long-term unemployment increasing and increasing even after the recoveries. Why? Because a lot of people are being displaced. Their skills are being displaced from what the job market needs. It's going to get much faster with this one. Already there's a wave of industrial automation happening, as a lot of businesses are just taking advantage of the software and hardware they have around them to try and survive. That's what happens. That's what happened to my father and uncle. They had jobs in Ontario's automotive manufacturing sector. In the early 2000s, they lost their jobs as businesses had to automate to stay competitive with China. So anytime there's like an economic shock, businesses reach out to the technology they have around them to survive. It's going to be much worse this time. So basic income will provide everyone the runway, the time they need to retrain, the time they need to like seek out the jobs they're really well suited for. It'll also be a cash stimulus for businesses because most people don't know this, but Canada already has a national scale basic income that's worked. It's called the Canada Child Benefit. And if you look at it from a bigger picture, over 400,000 families are getting more than $1,000 a month right now, including 100,000 single mothers. Over a million families are getting $600 a month right now. And that program has been proven to generate $4 of GDP growth for every dollar it costs. It drives $85 billion of business revenues and like $24 billion in corporate profits while keeping 588,000 children out of poverty. So we should double down on that. That works. That's what we need to get out of the economy, give everyone a long runway, stimulate the economy, and we have a more inclusive recovery.
One thing I want to ask, so we've touched on a couple arguments against a basic income. One is we can't afford it, and you've all done a great job on that. The other one is, people won't have an incentive to work. But another one I hear, and I was hoping maybe you could touch on this because you mentioned the role that civil servants play in delivering, government programs in general and social programs in particular. And so sometimes I hear people say, well, we don't want to bring in a basic income because all those civil servants who administer our current social service programs will lose their jobs, and we don't want them to lose their jobs. So do you want to maybe address that question?
Sure. I've worked with a lot of social work students, and I think most of them don't go into social work so that they can abuse and police poor people. I think they're really shocked and horrified when they find themselves in those kinds of jobs. If we can shift and move our systems around, I'm sure there's lots and lots of work we need in helping people to overcome addictions and helping people to recover from a lot of the mental health effects of having been living precariously, of having been homeless, etc. There's lots and lots of work we need social workers to do. And the government should employ them to do that, especially to help clean up the damage that's already been caused by decades of abuse of people. So to me, sure, there's going to be some shifts and changes. And I understand why a union that represents public service workers would do its job by standing in the ground for, people who runs social assistance and such. But if they take a longer look at the bigger picture, I think it's far healthier for everybody. And, I think, we all have families, we all have relations, we all live in communities. Like, we can't be blind to the fact that whether you're a welfare worker or a welfare recipient, if we had a just, fair, balanced system, we'd all be better off and we'd all be safer. So hopefully those that are worried about, I mean, change is always scary, but at this point, I feel like status quo is scarier than almost any change could be that, you know, that we could make in this country.
Yeah.
So, you know, again, it's a very good opportunity to like look around us. And, you know, for instance, there's a lot of women right now who I'm sure are trying to figure out how to like build their own lives and get the hell out of the relationship there, and the domestic violence is just going through the roof. How are we going to get those people, those families stabilized? There, so much can be solved, resolved, and helped to move forward by having a basic income. And if you weigh the pros and cons and the benefits against the disadvantages, I think, you know, a few jobs that might have to shift their focus is not the biggest loss.
So we're gonna wrap up, and I'm gonna give each of you an opportunity to just give a bit of a closing statement, so to speak. Before I do that, I just want to thank everyone who have been so actively engaged in the chat box. I love doing town halls, as my staff knows, and I miss that personal interaction that you receive in a town hall, and the body language of people and connecting on a real human level. But I'll have to say that the engagement on these online events through the chat box is something that would be very hard to replace in a in-person town hall. So I really want to say how much I thank everyone who's been so actively engaged and who have been a part of tonight's discussion. And we are recording this, and we can make this available to people because there's a lot of amazing information that's being shared with each other, and I'm looking forward to reading through all of it tomorrow. So maybe we'll do reverse order to how I introduced all of you, to just do some closing comments. So Floyd, I'll start with you and just say maybe in a minute or two, you know, sort of like what the closing message you would like to leave with all the hundreds of people watching tonight.
First of all, thanks everyone for being here. Learning about basic income at 7 p.m. on a Thursday is wonderful. I'm really excited about what a world will look like with the basic income. It's going to be amazing. Can you imagine? No one has to worry about survival. No one has to be ashamed of themselves for what they've achieved in life. They can actually pursue a higher potential for themselves. They can pursue their highest calling for what makes them feel useful. That's the kind of world that I want to live in. It'll be wonderful. And the only reason we don't have it now is because the current economic system has forgotten one of the key pillars that even the most right-wing economists had wanted. Like Friedrich Hayek, the libertarian icon, he was the huge pro-free market philosopher, wanted to have an income floor to ensure that no group becomes so vulnerable as to be exploitable by some other group. They weren't only concerned with government exploitation, they were also concerned with the exploitation of private interests and private powers. Milton Friedman, he wanted to have an income floor that was high enough that people could actually have a reasonable living. And because again, this is when capitalism was in Cold War with communism, it was in those years that 1,000 economists signed a letter saying that a basic income is compatible with American values. So I think we've just been missing a key part of the plumbing in a market-driven system to circulate some of the gains so that no one has to fall into poverty. And the problem isn't capitalism. The problem is that we haven't put in basic income in place, which should have been there from the beginning for hundreds of years. Imagine if we'd already had it and technology was even today uplifting everyone. The final piece that really captivates my imagination, hope it captivates yours, is that John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist on whose ideas we had the last post-war recovery, said that by now we should all be working part-time because productivity would be so great from technology. So I challenge you to think about it. How do you know if we're not already there? Maybe we're already there. Maybe the only reason that we're not having a lot of people working part-time and enjoying their lives is because the economy isn't producing enough high-income jobs for everyone. There's just simply not enough. So what are we going to do? Allow the bottom half of the country to toil away in low-income work that's getting worse and worse with every generation? Or are we going to start sharing in the gains from technology so that everyone can prosper from our collective inheritance of technological ingenuity and knowledge and all the amazing things that we're doing? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Floyd. I appreciate it. Jessie, you want to give a few closing thoughts? Oh, you're on mute.
Yep, there I am. Yeah, certainly, I definitely do. So I just wanted to thank everybody for participating in the panel discussion. A lot of people are saying, how can we help? How can we volunteer to help? Signing up for like UBI Works, the Basic Income Canada Network, the Basic Income Earth Network. There are a lot of basic income networks that are very much involved on and have their fingers on the pulse of what's happening in terms of basic income, both in Canada and around the world. So I'd encourage you to sign up for those. Definitely check out UBI Works, because they're doing a lot of, like, Floyd's doing amazing work, and the team there is just awesome. So like, that's what I also want to say. And then I also just say, like, the reason I've gotten part of this movement, like, both because it affected me personally and I was on this pilot, but now I'm just like, no, I really do believe in building a better world. I do believe that, like, the way that our society is right now is fundamentally broken, and something like COVID-19 really exposes the cracks and the brokenness in our society in such a very stark and horrible way. And I just hope that we remember this, and as we move forward, we take an opportunity like this pandemic, like this crazy event that is, you know, keeping us having Zoom calls instead of getting together in person, to really remember that we can do better, we can build a better world, and we can make a society where, when things like this happen, because they do and they will only happen again, we're prepared to do this and we're prepared to deal with this. And I just think that's part of building a better world. And even just like what Floyd was saying, like, why can't we have a world where people aren't, you know, struggling in the gig economy and struggling on minimum wage work? Why wouldn't we want a world where everybody succeeds and everybody benefits? Because that helps all of us. All of humanity benefits from this. Why I don't see this as a free government handout. I see it as an investment to the betterment of society. And studies and everything is showing us. And that's what we need to frame this as. This is building a better world. This is investing in humanity. This is a better society, and giving people the opportunity to pursue their dreams. So that's how I see basic income, and that's why I've dedicated my life to this. So yeah, that's what I want to say. But again, thank you everybody so much for coming in. Thank you, Josephine, Floyd, for all of your contributions, and Mike for organizing this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jessie. Josephine, what are your parting thoughts?
Well, you know, I remember growing up that one person could support a family, take holidays, have a cottage and a car, you know, holidays. It was a very different kind of world. Everybody had their door open. You know, I'm not saying that was that way for absolutely everybody in the country, but it was that way for most people. We've forgotten that. My children and my grandchildren have been robbed of their human rights. They struggle much harder than they should have to, particularly in contrast with earlier generations. This is completely unnecessary. We have the infrastructure, the framework, the rights, all of it, the constitutional rights to be able to have, you know, a healthy, decent, just, sustainable society. And I think this is a huge opportunity in this pandemic to be able to take back, reflect, and see, like, how valuable in fact is our time. We've forgotten the value of time itself. And perhaps understanding this now and seeing what's really going on and thinking about what we're facing in terms of climate change and eco-chaos and soil depletion and you name it. If we're going to repair and make our world a better place for our children, this is, you know, a very key tool to be able to make that happen. So I really hope that people understand and recognize that, you know, human rights are not a privilege, they're a right and a responsibility. And we all have a responsibility, particularly on behalf of our children, our elders, our neighbors, to push for human rights, to claim our human rights, and to insist our government does their job, and start off by making sure everybody has their basic needs met, and start off by introducing a basic income.
Well, I want to thank all three of you once again, and we can build a better world. And if we are going to build a better world, it's going to be because of people like the three of you and everyone who's actively engaging in this conversation. And I'm seeing a few people say that we have 3 politicians who have joined me on the screen. So if you're ever interested in running for office, let me know, because we obviously for the Green Party, but for any party, we need people like all three of you who are so articulate and smart and passionate people and want to make a better world. So thank you for joining us tonight. Everyone, thanks for being a part of this
Thank you, Mike.
historic event. So good night, be well, be safe, stay home, and I wish all of you well.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.